Okay, so what I'm going to do is sort of a lap around Xcode. I'm going to start Xcode from my dock by clicking on it. And I'm going to get the Welcome to Xcode dialog. You can choose whether or not you want to unclick this checkbox so that the next time Xcode launches, it doesn't launch this window. One of the nice things about this window is it does show you the recent set of projects that you've worked on. I find the dialogue to be a little obtrusive for me. That's just a personal thing. So whether or not you leave this turned on or turned off, this is what's going to happen when you first open Xcode. And of course, the first thing we'll want to do is create a new Xcode project. As I said, I generally like to not have that dialog up, so I'm going to go ahead and close Xcode and open up Xcode again. And now I just get the regular Xcode menu. From the File menu, I'm going to go ahead and select New Project. And we will talk about projects and workspaces in more detail in later modules. But you can see here that I have a number of templates, both for building iOS applications or OS X applications, either or. I'm going to go ahead and say I would like to create an iOS application. I'm going to go ahead and create a single view application, and I'm going to go ahead and select Next. Now, all of those different project types for iOS are all really the same underlying project. They are a project that outputs a product, which is a iOS application. They all have different starter files. That's the only difference between those different templates. And I'm going to go ahead and call this lap around Xcode. Now I have a few choices here on the new project dialog. I can specify what my organization name is going to be, the company identifier, which is generally going to be your domain name reversed. The bundle identifier, if you're building iOS applications, is going to become very important. It's important to know what your bundle identifier is, although you can change that later. If I want to add a class prefix to all my classes, I can do that here. I can specify what kind of devices I want this project to support, whether it's universal, iPhone, or iPad. I'm going to go ahead and select universal. Storyboards are an interface builder feature we'll talk a little bit about later in this course. Automatic reference counting. Generally, you will want to use automatic reference counting if you can. The only reason you wouldn't be able to is if you were targeting older versions of iOS. And then whether you want to include unit tests or not. I'm going to say no. And I'm going to go ahead and click Next. That's going to ask me where I would like to create this project. Also notice, as we'll talk about later, I can get Xcode to create a Git repository for me locally if I want to have it under a local source control. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to go ahead and click Create. So this is the project now opened up, and I have a couple of different areas. I have the Navigator area, and the Navigator area contains a number of navigators. You can see the Product Navigator, Project Navigator, Symbol Navigator, Search Navigator, Issue Navigator, Debug Navigator, Breakpoint Navigator, and Log Navigator. And all those navigators are fairly straightforward. Inside of the Project Navigator, I have a project hierarchy. And so this is a virtual hierarchy based upon how I want my files to be displayed inside of my project. You notice that all the navigators as well will have some functionality down at the bottom of the screen. Let me bring that up for you a little bit and sort of point it out. So there's a little toolbar down there, and a little toolbar we can do things like, hey, only show me files with unsaved changes, which there are none in this case, source control status, and recent files. I can actually add a new file here, or I can go and say new file and add a new file. There's another way to add a new file, which is actually go over to the file library, which is here inside of the library area. And I can actually drag and drop a file from the file template library if I wanted to. Up at the top, we've got the toolbar. You can customize this if you'd like. So you can say, I only want to see icons, or I want icons and text, which is the default, or just hide the toolbar depending on what you're doing. Looking for more screen real estate, hide the toolbar. I generally leave it open, but again, it's a personal decision. On the toolbar, I have the ability to build and run. I have the ability to select the active scheme, and we'll talk quite a bit about schemes in our module on building and debugging. I can control the status of breakpoints. This is my sort of like notification window. So when I do a build, which I can do by going to product, and I can say build for, let's say, testing, I get a build succeeded, and it tells me when, and so I get that information here inside of the sort of notification area. I have the editor buttons here, which can allow me to switch between the different editors, and we'll talk about those again in detail in a couple of the later modules of this course. I've got the view buttons, so if I don't want to see the navigator area, if I don't want to see the library and inspector area, which is the other area that's in that part of the screen, I can hide those as I want. I can also show or hide the debug area, which is this area down here. One of the things that you'll find with Xcode is Xcode will switch the way it looks based upon what it thinks you're doing, or what you not thinks you're doing, but what you are doing and what it thinks you might want. So for example, when I do debug, it'll actually bring up that debug area for me automatically, and it is incredibly customizable. If you want to change that behavior, you can actually do that as well. And then the last button here is the organizer, which we'll talk about the organizer in a little bit. Here is the inspector area. The inspector area will almost always show you two things. It will show you the file inspector, so it'll show you information about the file that you've currently got selected in the project navigator. So as you see, as I switch to another file, the inspector changes its information. And it always will have the quick help inspector, which, depending on the context of what you're doing, may or may not show anything. Notice that it doesn't show anything. And then if I click on some symbol that the help system knows about, quick help comes up automatically. And if I hover here long enough, quick help will show up there as well. So this is the editor area. Now, when I first created my project, I was in the editor area for the project itself. And the project has project setting and then target settings. And again, projects and targets we'll get into much more detail as we go along during the course. Just remember that this is the editor area. And once I'm in the editor area, if I want to see something, I can go to the recent files, and I can pick, for example, appdelegate.h, which is the file I opened by clicking on it over here. If I wanted to open appdelegate.m, I could click on that. And notice that I also here have what's called the jump list. And so the jump list, I can see all my files, and I can easily navigate between the different files as I need to. Once I'm inside of a particular file, I can actually click on the jump list, and it'll actually show me all of the members of the, in this case, Objective-C implementation file that I'm looking at. Most of the editor functionality in Xcode is highly oriented towards Objective-C. It does support C++, it does support C, but we'll see as we go along during the course that Objective-C is really the core language of Xcode. Although, again, if you want to build C++, you want to build C, great. Generally, most people today are building iOS applications with Objective-C and Xcode. Okay, so that's a nice sort of lap around the basic editor features. The other part of Xcode I mentioned before was Interface Builder. So if I look at Interface Builder, I can open up what's called a nib file. And inside of the nib file, what I'm able to do is visually edit my UI elements. In this case, the UI element I'm working with is something called a UI view, as the quick help tells me. I can go to the inspector area. Notice that there are more items on the inspector area because I've selected an object and an editor that presents more of those. One of those would be the attributes inspector. So I could do things like change the background of this to, I don't know, maybe a carnation. And I can do things like go down here to the object library, and I can drag and drop a label. And we will be talking about Interface Builder in a module later in this course, so we'll be talking about this in more detail. But as you can see, I can click around. I can change things, like say, hello, Xcode. And if I run this now, I'm going to select to run it on the iPhone simulator. If I select to run, it's going to go ahead and build. It's going to run that in the simulator. And as I mentioned about the simulator, if I wanted to switch the hardware of the simulator, I could say, okay, I want the 3.5 inch or I want the 4-inch version of the iPhone. Notice that it does require me to go back and to restart the debugging session. But you can see that this does bring up something that appears, as we go look at it, to be, sort of very similar to the iPhone. Notice, again, I'm running at a lower resolution than I normally do, so I need to scale the simulator down to something like 50%. And now if we see, you can see the hello Xcode, which I couldn't see on the screen before. Okay, so that's a quick lap around Xcode, introduction to the basics. We'll talk about a couple more things. And then as you move along during the course, as I said, we're going to dive down into detail on things like projects and workspaces, things like editors, and all of the different functionality that is built into the editing system. We'll talk about building and debugging. We'll talk about Interface Builder, and we'll talk about Organizer and the things that you can do there.